looking out today, I feel especially grateful to be here. I don't know why, but I do. Just wanted to say that. It feels good to be here this morning. Yes? So I wonder if any of you have heard of the doomsday clock. Anybody? Okay, a few. So the doomsday clock was a symbolic device invented in 1947 by a group of scientists at the University of Chicago as a basis of their estimation of how close humanity was to utter global destruction. They began it with an estimation of how close we were to nuclear war and fallout, but it's since been edited to include environmental factors, other forms of war, and technology consumption, and so on. So when the scientists originally created this clock, they set it at 7 minutes before midnight, the 0 hour for us. And over the years, they've since moved the minute hand of the clock backward or forward each year in their estimation, sometimes giving us a little more time on the planet Earth together, and sometimes a little less. So a few weeks ago, when they gathered to give their estimation for 2012, this group of scientists moved the minute hand on the doomsday clock 1 minute closer to midnight. They have us living at 11:55 p.m. This is one way to measure hope. Do you feel hopeful? As I look back over the past year that we've had together and try to make my own judgments about this situation, there's a cast of characters and events that stands out to me. Over our past trip around the sun, we in this room have been witness to wildfires and drought, deadly tornadoes and storms in our region here. We've seen the shooting of a U.S. Congresswoman, royal weddings, debates over presidential birth certificates, the death of bin Laden, a subdued end to an almost 9-year war while another longer conflict continues. We sat glued to television screens and iPads on the death of Steve Jobs. We've seen mass protests in the Middle East with the Arab Spring. We've seen the Occupy movement, another Twilight movie, and Lady Gaga singing to Bill Clinton. So, to be honest with you, if the decision was up to me, I don't know which way I would move the hand on the doomsday clock. But I do know how easy it is for us to feel like we don't have any agency in the world sometimes. I know how easy it is for my sense of hope and well-being in the world to be tied to these seemingly fleeting events. My political party wins an election. A piece of legislation I agree with is enacted. I am hopeful for our future. My party loses the next election. That piece of legislation is repealed. I'm in despair. I get the feeling it's always going to be this way. One war ends, another war begins, and my hope meter is going back and forth. I also know how easy it is for us to feel like we don't have agency in these larger issues because so many of our cultures have told us stories about what it means to be human that include these histories where everything is a descent into chaos. Sure, humanity started off in this ideal state, they tell us, long ago, but since then it's been downhill. The histories that our culture sometimes tell usually place us in the decay part of the spectrum. The Abrahamic faiths give us the Garden of Eden. The Hindus place us in the Kali Yuga. It's the last era of the world filled with vice and decay and destruction. Or maybe it's just that rhetoric of the good old days. That story of the good old days that so easily makes it into our politics and even our churches. Remember how nice it used to be around here? Remember how good our country was before, our city was before, our church was before? Whose good old days were those? I often wonder about that. Here I stand, this white, able-bodied, middle-class, straight American male in the 21st century. A trip back in time to those supposed good old days would probably only increase the amount of privilege that I carry based on our society, but I don't think a lot of people would want to take that trip back in time. I wonder why we get into that mindset of believing that the clock on the minute hand is just getting closer and closer to midnight no matter what we do. Especially in the face of a lot of evidence which suggests that things are actually getting better. I recently encountered a book by psychologist Steven Pinker. It's called The Better Angels of Our Nature. I see some heads nodding. So in this book, Steven Pinker has looked at evidence over the course of hundreds and thousands of years, homicide rates, casualty of war, death by disease, economic factors, and his claim is that it's safer to be an individual human being now on the planet Earth than it's ever been. That yes, we have very real environmental destruction before us if we don't do something about it. That yes, we have very real injustices that we have to address. But if he's right, then we live in the least cruel, least violent, and most peaceful era in human history. I don't believe it. I mean, I believe it, but I don't believe it. I know I believe that evidence. I know I see that crime rates go down in my city, and yet I'm more afraid than I've ever been about just living. I know that I can read that evidence and believe that he's an expert in his field, but I sense this huge weight of anxiety when I talk to people here in our church. When I talk to my friends and family, I sense this weight that we're not sure where we're going as a people. If the next generation's going to be better off than the one before it, if we're going to have a planet Earth to live on. I hear people that I love so dearly tell me that they're not sure they can make a difference anymore, or whether or not there's meaning to be found in our current age. And all the while, the safest, least cruel, least violent era in human history. I brought that cynicism to the first time that I read that poem by E.A. Markham that Kathleen read for us this morning. He calls it a history without suffering. Here the poet lines up these little vignettes, these little moments in human history where violence and suffering have been removed. A woman camps on the border of two countries safely overnight and no one notices. Someone in a city like London just paid the mortgage, is free of guilt, and not dying of cancer. He has this line at the end of the poem where he says, "This is all recommended reading, but in small doses. It shows that you can avoid suffering if you try." On my notes that I used in writing the sermon, I saw that the first thing I wrote the first day I read it next to this line was, "Yeah, right." Here the poet brings his imagination to offer to us these brief moments of peace. And I saw how easy it was to bring my stinging cynicism to what he presented. I think it's because I resonate so much with what he was saying, both in the world that he presents as a hopeful vision and in what we struggle with as human beings. He's got that image of the woman tilling the field, and she says that today her back does not hurt. Today she has been freed from the civil war in her heart. Today she has been freed from catechisms of self-pity and murder. That line stuck out in my mind, catechisms of self-pity and murder. I imagined this person, this woman, being forced to work the fields in the era of the Civil War, learning so much about what it means to be human through pretty nasty situations. Now, her story is not ours. But I wondered how often we take for granted catechisms that we learn about what it means to be a human being from the nightly news or so many religions which would have us tell us that human beings are defined by being nasty and brutish. I was talking to someone in the narthex before this service and said that I heard the Dalai Lama once say, the reason it's called news is because it's unusual. The bad news that you hear on the evening news, but I forget that all the time, and I repeat as if it were a creed sometimes, the selfishness or violence of a human being. What would it be like to be freed from that catechism for a day? To believe we're capable of something different. Earlier I preached this week at SMU with Scotty Johnson and Lissa Jenkins leading worship with me for some seminarians at Perkins School of Theology, and the lectionary text from the Bible that was assigned for me to reflect on that week was one from the Gospel of Mark, where Jesus comes into the temple and teaches and then casts a demon out of a sick man. This is not the kind of text I'm used to preaching on. But what really stood out to me is that in this text they mention all the time that Jesus taught as one with authority. That the amazing thing was that he taught like he had authority. And I remember asking myself, authority on what? Here's this country preacher who shows up from the middle of nowhere. He's not ordained, he is not credentialed, he is not a member of the community, nor does he have a large donation to make to the temple. He shows up in the pulpit and teaches and preaches with authority. One of the things that I think stands out to me about the teacher Jesus in these stories is here he is in the middle of this harsh world, occupied by the most repressive, largest, wealthiest, most powerful empire on the planet. The vast majority of people are in abject poverty. The sense of human worth is very low if you're not a person in power. And he is certain he's a child of God and has no problem telling other people that they are too. That's amazing to me. It's amazing to me the idea that in the midst of all of these situations about where we learn our human value, and in a pretty hard world, this teacher would think he had the authority to walk into a group of people, look them in the eye, and say, "Did you know that you have something of God in you? Heaven is here if you would act like it." Boy, it's hard to act like a child of God. You can see why people get persecuted for going around saying that kind of stuff, when we're told where our human value comes and what we're worth on a daily basis from a lot of other sources. Now, one of the ways I understand the divine is that emergent creative force that brings new life into being that wasn't there before. It's that mysterious source that explodes stars and moves shoots from the ground and beats a human heart. And I sense that holy nature in us, in our human ability to imagine a different world than the one we have. That creativity in us, that stirring. In the poem, thoughts higher than their thinkers. And I know that I gloss over those parts of me all the time. It's hard to preach the other catechism, the one of human potential and goodness and creativity. I am worried and frightened to stand up in front of a group of people, even you, to be honest, a little bit, and preach that I truly believe that, because I know my own cynicism. I know how I have thought about that message when I've heard it before. I know that to stand up and say I am actually hopeful because we have a creative center at our heart, I'm scared I'm going to sound naive and simple and stupid. I'm scared people are going to think I haven't been paying attention to the evidence. I know that I myself have cringed when I've seen these syrupy, sweet depictions of the religiously devout. People who think that if you love God enough, you'll be rich and healthy, or that religion is more about personal morality than building the beloved community on earth. Perhaps it's because when I start to imagine the kind of world we could build, it means I'm drawn very close to really hard parts to deal with. When I start to imagine a world of economic justice, then I have to get really close to the reality of poverty and the things I participate in that help keep people poor. When I imagine a life where I am more just and kind and generous and forgiving, I have to get really close to those very real moments where I'm petty and selfish and greedy. So many people seem to be the authority on human badness. So many people seem on television or in conversations with me to speak with confidence and authority on the decay of humanity in our world. There is something else you can be the authority on: the goodness in you. Nobody else knows it like you do. No institution, no church, no government can give it to you or take it away. No one can stop your capacity to imagine a just and loving world. You can be the authority on that voice, even if it means having to silence some of the other ones. There is a story I love about the Zen Buddhist and musician John Cage, about what he heard when he got really quiet. He had to get really quiet by going into what's called an anechoic chamber. It's a room without echoes. Here's what he said about his experience. I entered one of these chambers at Harvard University several years ago, and I heard two sounds, one high and one low. When I described them to the engineer in charge, he informed me that the high sound was my nervous system in operation. The low sound was my blood circulating. Until I die, he says, there will be sounds, and they will continue following my death. One need not fear the future of music. One need not fear the future of the goodness that moves in you. That spark, that moment where you know the difference between the world as it is and the world as it could be, that voice that I'm assuming most of you know, that you felt, that you recognize when you get quiet enough. Perhaps that stirring that is in you today that knows the kind of life you wish you could live. The kind that imagines a world, a history without suffering. And the kind that we so often ignore or cover up. I talked with a member of our church this week named Jennifer, and she told me that she works as part of a large governmental organization that has decided that it wants to make its culture more reflective and caring. And they asked for her input. And Jennifer brought to them a proposal that would include involving 4,000 employees in a regular process of reflection that's modeled after our small group ministry program at the church called Circles. I would love to have seen how that meeting went. I love the idea of 4,000 people in a bureaucratic organization undergoing a process that came through our church. And I think it would be very hard to make real. But no matter what the result is of her proposal, I love the courage and vision that she brought to that. I love that she thought that her vision of what she could do in her workplace was worthy of being shared, that big, hard to carry out vision. I love that her experience in our church led her to believe that she was called to change the organization she works in, even if it means changing the behavior of 4,000 people. Boy, it takes guts to offer up that kind of alternative. And I pray that our church can continue to be that kind of place that facilitates that spark, that spirit in people. Because it is so easy to spend our days making other people's souls small, trampling right over other people's intentions and visions because of our ego or believing that our mission is the mission. Our institutions, even our churches, unfortunately, can get myopically concerned with our own maintenance. Asked if we're succeeding, we can quickly spout off numbers about the budget or the membership rolls. I wonder how we will gauge success in this church. How you will gauge whether or not our church is working. Is it in the membership numbers? How many people show up on Sunday, whether or not you liked a class or a sermon or a program? Or is it whether or not we have the courage to find the spirit and the image of God in the human beings around us and call them to change the world in radical ways? Whether we are willing to be called naive and silly and stupid by lifting up a vision of hope and transformation for a world that could use it. That's not my job. That's our job. Our church can be a laboratory filled with a collection of mad scientists eagerly cooking up a batch of the world to come, gauging our success by whether or not we bless and transform those who come into this place and make them believe they can change the world. Now, ultimately, I don't know where the hand on the clock is moving. I'm guessing everybody has their own feeling about that in the room. But my ultimate hope is not tied to the next election or the next piece of legislation, the next event in our lives, but whether you in this room are willing to engage us in the radical practice of seeing something holy and creative and dynamic moving in you, and whether or not you have the courage to speak it out loud. It takes courage to act like a worthy, loved child of infinite mystery. Try it. Try asking someone else to act as if they are a worthy, loved child of infinite mystery. And tell me how that conversation goes. The Jewish mystic and justice worker, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, said this: "Remember that there is meaning beyond absurdity. Be sure that every little deed counts, that every word has power, that we can, everyone, do our share to redeem the world. And above all, remember that the meaning of life is to build a life as if it were a work of art. You are not a machine. So start working on this great work of art called your own existence." It is easy to tell small stories about what we're capable of, to repeat the tired old catechisms we have learned over and over again, and I am ready for a new story. I'm ready for us to tell a new story about what we are capable of as people. It's so easy to forget that place in us, to overlook or cover up that creativity, but you are not a machine. The fullness of your humanity, your hope, can never be fully contained by any one event or the number in your bank statement or any political party or any event or any church. There is something so profoundly good in you. And my hope, in part, rests on your willingness to speak up about it. So what better time than now?